Hello, my name is Jade McGarry and I am a PhD candidate and casual academic at Griffith University on the Gold Coast in Australia. I've recently had a journal article published in the Violence Against Women journal titled Framing Public versus Private Violence, an inductive thematic analysis of the Australian, the West Australian, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and the Sydney Morning Herald, so essentially of news media in Australia. A little bit about myself. So I'm an early career researcher. Evidently, I'm in the process of completing my PhD now. This paper that was published is actually a product of my PhD. It's my first research methodology. But before we get there, I might just kind of start with a little bit of a background of my research and my approach to dealing with research concerning violence against women. So my early research was really interested in media coverage and specifically media coverage of security issues. So what we see in an Australian context specifically is that terrorism really dominates this media coverage and this national conversation about security. So researchers also found that terrorism itself actually presents as more of an existential threat. There's really low death tolls related to terrorism in Australia. But media still, quite often perpetuates a narrative of risk, threat, and threats to security of Australians. So my early research really looked at media coverage of terrorism, terrorism's conflation with Islam, the far right's media coverage of terrorism and fear and strategy. But my PhD started to kind of emerge when I was starting to question this idea, this notion that terrorism is the threat to security, although the numbers don't really reflect that. So what is a key security threat for Australians? And the answer is domestic and family violence. So in Australia, currently, one woman is killed on average every 4 days by their current or former partner, which is a very concerning number. Last year, we saw a rapid increase in the deaths of Australian women at the hands of their partners. So I really wanted to start exploring this idea of security and the reality of security. So, statistically, what is the biggest threat to Australians? And the answer is domestic violence. So my research is kind of looking at these two ideas. So this idea of terrorism as the primary security threat, although the numbers don't really reflect that, and domestic and family violence, which is actually not considered a primary threat to the security of Australians, nor is it considered a national security issue, despite numbers showing that it is a considerable issue in this country and a massive issue that's faced by Australian women, that it is a threat to Australian women. So this study, again, looks at public opinion, and public opinion is public opinion is created by the news media. So heavily influences the way people think about issues, specifically security issues, is the news media. So this study looks at media coverage of both terrorism and domestic and family violence to start to look at perceived connections between the two issues, perhaps subconscious or conscious connections between the two issues, to kind of understand how these two issues are presented to Australians, how they're framed. So that's sort of the premise of the research. So in order to conduct this research, I looked for articles that contain both the term terrorism and the phrase domestic violence. So this data set is quite unique. There is a significant body of literature, especially in Australia, that looks at media coverage of domestic and family violence and media coverage of terrorism, but very, very rarely, if ever, looked at in conjunction with one another. So this research is quite unique, and it's quite jarring for some people because it's kind of these two unrelated issues. So I have faced significant resistance, evidently, as you do in the violence against women space, on kind of conflating these two ideas. So this research did find that domestic and family violence and terrorism is discussed in conjunction with one another, in terms of funding, allocation of resources, threats to security. We see them discussed in the budget quite often. But interestingly, and quite connected to my PhD thesis, is this idea of using the term terrorism to describe domestic and family violence. So this research found that advocates, academics, victims, survivors, perpetrators, politicians, did use the term terrorism to describe domestic violence, although this is sort of a current that's that exists, a thread, but isn't really grabbed onto. So this research, this paper, again, is a product of my PhD thesis, which looks more widely at this idea of using the term terrorism, which evidently has significant amount of power, influence in the public sphere, to describe domestic and family violence, to sort of give some of its power to this issue that permeates Australian society and threatens the safety of Australian women. So my PhD itself has two research methodologies. One, which is this paper, which is kind of exploring media coverage and how this impacts the way we think about these two issues. And the second is a series of interviews. So I actually conduct over 14 interviews with a series of politicians, academics, researchers, domestic and family violence advocates, people that work with men to prevent violence. And we kind of start to unpack this question of, well, can we call domestic and family violence terrorism in order to kind of escalate and further give support and stimulation to public conversations about this issue, because it's so ill-considered in regard to the security of Australians. So thank you so much, and I really hope you do read my research. I would love to hear from you. Feedback, good, bad, is all helpful. So thank you very much.